Romans is a very complicated book, deep theology. So let's see if we can sort of unpack it a bit. But of course, we've got to have something to put a smile on our face. 2020, we often think, what happened in 1960 and what happened in 1970 and what. Well, I think 2020 will truly be the year in which our wheelie bins go out far more than what we've ever gone out. The next slide, which kind of introduces our talk today on the armor of God and the breastplate of righteousness. You remember the comedy as Army. Well, this comes from there, and I'll read it out. Stay alert, Wilson. What should I be alert for, sir? Hidden threats. How will I spot them if they are hidden, sir? Don't let's have any of that sort of talk, Wilson. I want you to go out on patrol as normal, and if you spot anything invisible that doesn't look right, shoot it. I love British comedy, isn't it lovely? Well, let's move on to our focus on the breastplate of righteousness. Last week we looked at the helmet of salvation, and today we're going to look at that breastplate of righteousness. Now, it's interesting the way Paul puts these two concepts together. He talks about righteousness, but then he uses the analogy of the breastplate. And the weekly news I've sent out, I've sort of put a bit of a brief in there about the concept of the chest being a really vital part of our physical bodies, and it needs the protection of our rib cage, as it were. And there's many a time when we're under stress or under pressure, we often feel that tension in our rib cage. And that's, in a sense, what we're talking about today. We're talking about what's happening inside our rib cage, what's happening inside, as it were, our soul, our very being, our very essence. Because when we speak about righteousness, it's a big word. It means a lot theologically. But there are other terms too that Paul uses that are big words theologically that we need to sort of think about to get the true meaning of this concept of the breastplate of righteousness. The four main theological themes we need to explore are righteousness, but also faith and salvation and justification. And I think once we sort of have a look more carefully at these key words, I think it'll help us understand why Paul uses the analogy of the breastplate to represent our righteousness, which of course we know to be Jesus himself. Jesus is our righteous one. And look at the word righteous. Righteous really means to be in a right relationship with God. Be in a right relationship with God. And that's something that we're not born into. We are not born into a right relationship with God. And if we look at some of those key indicators of what this might look like, what righteousness might look like, those words in blue, blameless, pure, truthful, faultless, virtuous, these are concepts which, truth be told, none of us could consistently display them. It's something that we all fall quite far short of in our daily lives. So righteousness is something which we need, but we don't have in our natural selves, and we can't work towards it either. Because for us to be in a right relationship with God requires that we become righteous all the time. So it's something which we are almost set up to fail immediately, unless, of course, someone else helps out. In order for us to be right before God, there is something we need. That righteousness before God comes through faith in the Lord Jesus. Now, faith, if we want to define that, is a conviction that God is all he claims to be. A conviction that God is all he claims to be. Not a hope, not a desire, not wishful thinking, but a genuine conviction that God is who he claims to be. And here again, if we look at some of the words that would describe faith, like trust and confidence, an informed decision, it's reliance, it's assurance, that faith is not something which we conjure up inside ourselves. Faith is a gift from God. God gives us the gift of faith to appropriate the righteousness of Jesus in our life. So faith is indispensable to us being found righteous before God or having a right relationship with God. But let's go to the next key theme or word, and that of salvation. I like this picture that sort of highlights the meaning of it. Here's a girl who's on a cliff top hanging over the edge, or the edge of a building really, and she's reaching out hoping that somebody's going to save her, to stop her from falling down to the road below. And so salvation, a lovely definition of it, is a rescue by God from an impossible predicament. So an impossible predicament that we find ourselves in is that we are unrighteous before God, and we are unable to make ourselves right with God. This is an impossible predicament we have. And so we're relying on a rescue mission from God. And that's where Jesus comes in. And this is where Lorna spoke last week about the salvation, the importance of the salvation in terms of our standing before God. So we look at some of those words that describe salvation. It's a recovery, it's a snatching away from, or a deliverance from something. It gives us an escape route. We're able to escape the unrighteousness of which we are born into. We're able to escape this alienation from God and be reconciled to God, to find ourselves in a right relationship with God when we appropriate the gift of faith and apply it to our salvation, accepting that Jesus, the only one, could rescue us from our predicament. And so we move to the last slide with these big words, that of being justified. And you have a picture of a bird being set free from a cage. To use the legal analogy, once we accept by faith that Jesus truly has come to save us from our unrighteousness so that we may be justified or righteous in God's sight, we find ourselves being set free. We are found to be innocent of all charges and vindicated by what Jesus did on the cross. Jesus' death and resurrection, when we appropriate that by faith, that gift, when we appropriate that salvation which is ours freely given, we find ourselves justified before God, exonerated. We are free, we are holy, we are able to stand before a righteous God in the righteousness of Jesus that he bought for us. And so let's bring these all together. If we look at this story, here's a picture of a father with his son on his back. Righteousness through faith. We know that God is righteous and we are just not righteous. We are not born righteous. Instead, we are born broken relationships with one another and especially with God. But Jesus comes to rescue us from this unrighteousness. He comes freely, recognizing that we are in an impossible predicament. And so salvation comes to us as a gift to exonerate us from our unrighteousness. And when we exercise the gift of faith, we're able to receive that salvation, put that helmet on and know that we have been made right with God. And this righteousness, this clothed with Christ, is a gift that we can only receive. To receive it, we must. It's not gained by works. It's not gained through effort. It's a gift, but we have to receive it. And once we receive it, we find ourselves being clothed in Christ, in the righteousness of Jesus. And we find ourselves to be in a right relationship with him again. So this breastplate is key to us understanding how we stand in relation to a holy and righteous God. The last one we look at is reminding us of that helmet, that plume which said we belong to Jesus. And when we put on that helmet of salvation, we know that it then begins to renew our thinking about ourselves, about our world, and about God. And once we have that salvation and we recognize that the breastplate of righteousness protects our souls as God restores in us a right relationship with himself by adopting us as his own, rescuing us from death, and freeing us, exonerating us to love and serve. So my prayer for you this week as you go out is that you remember that God is wanting to renew us, our hearts especially, to be righteous in his sight. So let's be teachable people. Amen.